When we picture the British Empire at its zenith, we see the colour red. We see the serried ranks of the infantry, the glint of bayonets under a Spanish or Indian sun, and the stoic faces of men who conquered the world. We are told these men were heroes, patriots, or perhaps victims of a brutal discipline. But we rarely ask the most fundamental question of all. We rarely ask to see their bank accounts. If we could look past the smoke of Waterloo or the dust of the Crimea and examine the pockets of the men standing in that thin red line, we would find something shocking. They were empty. For 2 centuries, the British Army was not just a military force. It was a complex financial extraction system designed to keep its workforce in a state of perpetual, inescapable poverty. We often hear about the blood price paid by the soldier. But what about the cash price? To understand why the British soldier was often called the scum of the earth, we have to stop looking at battle maps and start looking at the ledgers. We have to ignore the generals and follow the money. And the story begins not on a battlefield, but in the sticky, sawdust-covered floor of a local tavern, with a man who is essentially a state-sponsored con artist, the recruiting sergeant. The year is 1805. Or perhaps 1845, the economics remain brutally consistent. A recruiting sergeant enters a pub in a depressed market town. He is dressed in the finest uniform money can buy, often paid for out of his own pocket to ensure the allure is perfect. He is the peacock designed to catch the eye of the desperate. He slams a handful of gold and silver coins onto the table. This is the bait. He weaves a tale of a gentleman's life. He tells the unemployed weavers and hungry farmhands that the king needs men, and the king pays well. 1 shilling a day. To a labourer earning 10 shillings a week when he can find work, 7 shillings a week guaranteed sounds like a fortune. It is steady, it is secure, and there is the bounty, the signing bonus. 3 guineas, maybe 5. A year's wages handed over in an instant. It is a dazzling amount of capital for a man who has likely never held a gold coin in his life. The alcohol flows, paid for by the sergeant. The desperate young man looks at the coin, the famous king's shilling. He takes it. He drinks to the king's health. He has just signed a financial contract that will likely ruin him. The moment that shilling touches his palm, the trap snaps shut. The recruit believes he has just been hired for a job. In reality, he has just entered a system of indentured servitude, where the employer charges the employee for the privilege of working. The recruiting sergeant knows the truth. He knows that the 1 shilling a day is a fiction. It is a gross figure before tax, before expenses, before the system takes its cut. The sergeant is a commission-based salesman. He gets paid per head. He is not recruiting soldiers. He is harvesting raw capital for the regiment. As the hangover sets in and the recruit is marched to the depot, the financial reality begins to dawn. The first shock comes almost immediately. That bounty, the 3 or 5 guineas he was promised, it is gone before he even leaves the British Isles. The army does not provide a uniform for free. It does not provide a backpack, hairbrushes, shoe polish, or shirts. These are necessaries, and the cost of these necessaries is deducted from the bounty. It is the first entry in the Iron Ledger. The recruit is told he needs a kit. The quartermaster hands him a knapsack, 2 shirts, 2 pairs of shoes, a pair of trousers, and a stock for his neck. The recruit nods, thinking these are gifts from the king. Then he is handed the bill. The cost of the kit often exceeds the bounty. The recruit has not even learned how to march, and he is already in debt to his captain. This is the indentured mercenary model. The regiment is not a public service. It is a proprietary business owned by a colonel and managed by captains. The soldier is the asset, and like any asset in the Industrial Revolution, the goal is to minimize the cost of maintenance while maximizing output. The recruit is now in debt to the captain. Until that debt is cleared, he will not see a single penny of pay. He works for free, marching, drilling, and cleaning, just to pay off the interest on his own existence. The recruiting sergeant's promise of wealth has evaporated, replaced by a balance sheet that starts in the red. And it is designed to stay there. Once the recruit realizes he is trapped, he looks for someone to blame. He looks to the officers, the men on horseback, but he rarely understands the corporate structure he has joined. In the 18th and early 19th centuries, a regiment of foot was not merely a military unit, it was a franchise. The CEO of this franchise was the colonel. Today we think of a colonel as a senior rank, a stepping stone to general. But in the Georgian era, a colonelcy was a property right. A wealthy aristocrat would purchase the right to raise a regiment or invest heavily to acquire one. This could cost thousands of pounds, an immense capital investment comparable to building a factory or buying a trading ship. And like any investor in the age of unbridled capitalism, the colonel expected a return on investment. He didn't buy the regiment for glory alone. He bought it for the off-reckonings. This archaic term is the smoking gun of British military corruption. Here is how it worked. The Treasury allocated a specific budget for clothing the regiment. This money was handed directly to the colonel. It was his responsibility to find a contractor, buy the red cloth, and hire tailors to stitch the uniforms. Crucially, there was no audit. There was no quality control. If the colonel could clothe his men for less than the government allocation, he legally pocketed the difference. The financial incentive was perverse but clear. The worse the uniform, the richer the colonel. If a colonel spent the full allocation on high-quality wool to keep his men warm in a Canadian winter, he made zero profit. But if he found a contractor in the back alleys of Leeds who could supply shoddy, a cheap recycled wool made by shredding old rags and pressing them back together, he could skim hundreds, sometimes thousands of pounds a year. The result was an army dressed in costumes, not clothing. To the civilian observer watching a parade, the soldiers looked magnificent. The redcoats were bright, the lace was white, the buttons shined. But it was a facade. The cloth was often so thin you could see through it. In the rain, it acted like a sponge. In the wind, it offered no more protection than a linen shirt. When the British Army marched into the freezing sleet of the Crimean Peninsula, men died of exposure while wearing their coats. They froze to death, wrapped in the colonel's profit margin. This was not accidental incompetence. It was institutionalized racketeering. The clothing colonels, as they were known, sat on boards in London, far from the front lines, negotiating contracts that shaved pennies off every yard of cloth. A penny saved on a coat, multiplied by 800 men, multiplied by 10 years, built country estates and paid for parliamentary seats. The soldier shivering on sentry duty was the primary victim of this embezzlement. He was forced to pay for the replacement of this uniform out of his own wages when it inevitably fell apart, while the man who sold it to him sat by a roaring fire in a London club. The soldier, however, had more immediate concerns than the quality of his coat. He was worried about his stomach. Having realized his bounty was a lie and his uniform was a prop, he turned his attention to his daily wage. The famous King's Shilling, 12 pence a day. Surely, even after the deductions for the kit, there would be enough for a man to live like a king, or at least like a gentleman. But, as the recruit would soon discover, the army had also privatized his appetite. The shilling was about to undergo a dissection so thorough that by the time it reached the soldier's pocket, it would be little more than copper dust. Let us perform a forensic audit on that single shilling. Place the silver coin on a wooden table. It represents 12 pence. This is the soldier's gross daily income. In the civilian world of the 19th century, 12 pence a day is a low wage, but survivable. A bricklayer might earn 3 shillings, a farm labourer perhaps 2. But the civilian keeps his wage, the soldier does not. The first hand to reach for the coin is not the soldier's, but the captain's. He takes 6 pence, exactly half the daily wage, for messing. This is the mandatory deduction for food. In theory, 6 pence should buy a decent amount of sustenance. In the 1840s, A loaf of bread cost about 7p, a pound of meat roughly similar. But the soldier did not shop at the market. He ate what the commissariat provided. And what did 6p buy in the regimental economy? It bought 3/4 of a pound of meat, usually beef or pork, often salted to the durability of shoe leather, and a pound of bread. That was it. For decades, there was no allowance for vegetables, no milk, no tea, no coffee. 2 meals a day, a breakfast of bread and water, and a dinner of boiled meat and the water it was boiled in. The soldier was paying 50% of his income for a diet that guaranteed malnutrition. He was essentially being charged restaurant prices for prison food. But the dissection continues. The shilling is now down to 6p. Next comes the washing and cleaning deduction. The army demanded the soldier look pristine. His belts had to be whitened with pipe clay. His brass buttons had to shine like mirrors. His shirts had to be laundered. The army did not pay for these cleaning supplies. The soldier did. Another penny and a half is scraped off the table. Then come the necessaries. This is a vague, catch-all category that functioned like a hidden service fee. Did the soldier need a new pair of socks? Deduction. Did he need a haircut? Deduction. Did he need to replace the razor he was forced to buy? Deduction. Another penny, perhaps two, vanishes. We are now left with mere coppers. But the institutional hand is not finished. The soldier was even taxed for his own future and his own administration. A deduction was made for the Chelsea Hospital, the pension home for invalids, whether the soldier ever made it there or not. He was paying insurance premiums to a company that rarely paid out. Even stranger, he was charged agency fees. The regimental agent, the civilian banker who handled the payroll, took a cut for the service of processing the money. The soldier was literally paying the bank for the privilege of being underpaid. By the time the captain's hand retracts, what is left on the table? From the original 12p, the soldier is staring at perhaps 2p. In bad months, where the price of bread fluctuated or a new kit item was needed, the surplus might be 1 penny, or nothing at all. This is the Iron Ledger at its most brutal. A man who risks his life for the empire is left with a disposable income of 1 penny a day. To put that in perspective, in 1850, a copy of the Times newspaper cost 5p. A soldier could not even afford to read about the wars he was fighting. He was economically illiterate, barred from participation in society by sheer lack of capital. This financial destitution explains the social pathology of the redcoat. We read accounts of soldiers being drunkards, gamblers, and ruffians. We view this as a moral failing. The ledger tells us it was an economic inevitability. What does a man do with 1 penny? He cannot save it. To buy a small cottage would take him 300 years. He cannot invest it. He cannot support a family. The only thing in Georgian England that cost 1 penny and offered an escape from the misery of the barracks was a pint of beer or a dram of cheap gin. The system incentivized drunkenness because alcohol was the only luxury calibrated to the soldier's poverty. The king's shilling was a scam. The soldier wasn't a professional warrior. He was a pauper in a red coat, working for food and shelter, trapped in a cycle where his only financial agency was the choice between a pipe of tobacco or a glass of gin. And just when he thought he had mastered the art of surviving on nothing, the army had one more way to bankrupt him: the hospital stoppage. In the modern world, we consider sick leave a basic right. If you fall ill in the service of your employer, you are protected. In the British Army of the 19th century, sickness was treated less like a biological misfortune and more like a breach of contract. The administration viewed a sick soldier with deep suspicion. Was he truly ill, or was he malingering, shirking his duty to avoid the lash of the sergeant major or the monotony of the drill? To solve this management problem, the army applied the only tool it trusted: economic sanctions. They monetized the hospital bed. The hospital stoppage was perhaps the most cruel entry in the Iron Ledger. When a soldier reported sick and was admitted to the regimental hospital, his pay was immediately docked. The logic was cold but consistent. If the soldier was in the hospital, he was not eating the company mess, so he shouldn't pay the messing deduction. Instead, he would pay a hospital deduction, but the rates were punitive. For much of this period, the stoppage was set at 9 or 10 pence a day. Remember, the daily wage was 12 pence. This left the sick man, who might be fighting off typhus, recovering from a flogging, or shivering with malaria, with a net income of almost zero. In some cases, if he required extras, like wine or specific medicines not covered by the standard issue, he could slide into debt. This created a terrifying, perverse incentive. A soldier feeling the early onset of dysentery or the rattle of a chest infection faced a choice. He could report to the surgeon, get admitted, and lose the tiny sliver of financial freedom he had. Or he could hide his illness. He could suppress the cough, bind his own wounds with rags, and stay in the barracks. The majority chose the barracks. They chose to remain in the crowded, unventilated rooms, sleeping 2 or 4 to a bed, coughing into the air breathed by their comrades. The economic penalty for sickness directly fueled the epidemics that ravaged the British Army. By fining men for being ill, the army ensured that infectious diseases were incubated in the ranks until they became uncontainable. The ledger demanded efficiency, but it created a biological time bomb. And for those who did enter the hospital, the value for money was non-existent. We must not imagine a place of white sheets and nurses. The regimental hospital was often a repurposed barn or a stifling tent. There were no professional nurses. That reform was decades away. The orderlies were other soldiers, usually the ones considered too stupid or too clumsy for the front line. These men were often unpaid for this extra duty or paid in alcohol. Accounts from the era paint a horrific picture of this healthcare system. The orderlies, unpaid and unsupervised, would often steal the comforts meant for the dying. The port wine prescribed by the doctor to strengthen a feverish patient would be drunk by the nurse while the patient lay gasping for water. The soldier was paying 10 pence a day to be neglected by a drunkard. When a soldier finally succumbed to the bacteria or the bullet, the final economic transaction took place, the effects and credits. His kit was auctioned off to his comrades, who would buy his spare shirt or shoes to replace their own worn-out gear. The proceeds were used to pay off his debts to the captain. If there was anything left, a few shillings perhaps, it might be sent to his next of kin, often years later. But usually the soldier died as he had lived, breaking even. The soldier was the victim of this economy. The colonel was the profiteer. But there is a third player in this game, a shadowy figure who never held a musket but controlled the destiny of every man who did. To understand how thousands of pounds flowed from the treasury to the pockets of the elite, we must leave the barracks and travel to the smog-choked streets of London. We must visit the office of the true master of the military economy, the regimental agent. While the soldier rotted in a tent in Badajoz or Bombay, his money was taking a very different journey. It was sitting in a mahogany-panelled office in London, likely near Charing Cross. This was the domain of the regimental agent. If the colonel was the CEO of the regiment, the agent was its chief financial officer, its banker and its broker rolled into one. And almost every penny spent by the British Army passed through his hands. The British government did not have a centralised pay corps. The Treasury found it too tedious to calculate the wages of 50,000 individual soldiers scattered across the globe. Instead, they outsourced the entire operation to private civilian firms. The most famous of these was Cox and Company, a banking house that became so powerful it was essentially the shadow treasury of the British Empire. Here is how the money flowed. The government issued a lump sum for a regiment's pay to the agent. In theory, the agent was supposed to forward this money immediately to the paymasters in the field. But in the days of sale, communication took months. This created a massive float. The agent held huge sums of government cash in his vaults for weeks or months before it was called for. He didn't just let it sit there. He invested it. He played the markets. The regimental agents became fabulously wealthy, not just by collecting their fees, but by leveraging the lag time between the treasury signing the check and the soldier needing the shilling. But the agent's power went deeper than mere payroll. He was the gatekeeper of the officer class. In the 18th and 19th centuries, you did not pass an exam to become an officer. You bought the job. This was the purchase system, and the regimental agent was the real estate broker for these military properties. If a lieutenant wanted to become a captain, he had to pay the established price, perhaps £1,500 or £2,000. He would deposit this money with the agent. The agent would then transfer it to the selling officer, taking a percentage for the trouble. The agent knew the financial secrets of every officer in the army. He knew who was in debt to his tailor, who had lost money at the gambling tables, and who was desperate to sell his commission to avoid bankruptcy. This relationship created a conflict of interests so profound, it is hard for modern minds to grasp. The agent was technically responsible for the welfare of the common soldier. He was the one processing their pay. But his true clients, the ones who made him rich, were the officers and the colonels. Consequently, when a soldier had a grievance, perhaps his pay was late or his off-reckonings were miscalculated, he had absolutely no recourse. To complain to the War Office was useless. They would refer him to the agent. To complain to the agent was impossible. The soldier was a distinct social inferior, a mere number in a ledger. The agent worked for the colonel, and the colonel profited from the status quo. The agent also handled the supply contracts. When a colonel needed to buy that shoddy wool we discussed, he often did it through the connections of the agent. These firms were the quiet engine room of the military-industrial complex. They ensured that war was, above all, a solvent business. They sanitized the blood money. By the time the cash reached the agent's ledger, it didn't look like the proceeds of a starry-eyed recruit's misery. It looked like 4% interest compounded annually. Yet, even this system, built on graft and tradition, could not survive the collision with the modern world forever. The purchase system and the clothing kernels were relics of a feudal past, surviving into the age of steam and statistics. The breaking point would not come from a reformer's speech in Parliament. It would come from a disaster so complete, so public, and so expensive that the Iron Ledger finally crashed. For 40 years following the defeat of Napoleon, the British Army existed in a state of suspended animation. The generals aged, the uniforms became tighter and more decorative, and the colonels continued to skim their profits from the clothing allowances. In the drawing rooms of London, the army was a pageant. In the ledgers of the Treasury, it was a model of fiscal restraint. But in 1854, the ledger collided with reality. The British Empire went to war with Russia. The Crimean War was the first industrial conflict, yet the British Army arrived, managed by a feudal bureaucracy. When the expeditionary force landed, it looked magnificent. The Redcoats were vibrant, the bearskins were tall. But as the glorious autumn turned into the brutal Russian winter, the off-reckoning system was exposed for what it was, a death sentence. The breakdown was total. As the temperature dropped to freezing, the cost-cutting measures of the previous decades began to kill men by the thousands. The shoddy coats, purchased to maximize the colonel's profit margin, disintegrated. They became stiff boards of frozen wool that offered zero insulation. The boots, supplied by contractors who had undercut the competition by pennies, were found to have soles made of compressed paper or pasted leather. In the mud of the trenches, the soles simply dissolved, leaving soldiers to wrap their rotting feet in rags cut from their blankets. The commissariat, trained to save pennies rather than save lives, collapsed. There are accounts of ships laden with greatcoats and cabbages sitting in the harbour at Balaclava, unable to unload because no one had the correct signature on the correct form. The green coffee scandal became the symbol of this bureaucratic murder. The Treasury had sent coffee beans to the troops to boost morale. But to save money on processing, they sent raw, green beans. The soldiers, freezing in the mud with no fuel to build fires, were given hard, unroastable beans. They died of dysentery and exposure while sitting on sacks of food they couldn't eat. But the true revolution of the Crimea was not the incompetence. It was the publicity. For the first time in history, the Iron Ledger was audited in public. William Howard Russell, a correspondent for the Times, was on the ground. He did not write the usual heroic puff pieces. He wrote forensic accounts of the suffering. He described the walking skeletons and the men dying of water on the brain caused by starvation. His dispatches arrived in London via telegraph and steamship, landing on the breakfast tables of the middle class. The public was horrified. They realized that the soldiers were not scum to be ignored. They were victims of a corrupt management class. The clothing colonel system was flayed in the press. The public began to ask why a colonel was making an £800 profit on uniforms, while the men wearing them were freezing to death. The king's shilling had been exposed as a fraud. The soldier had held up his end of the bargain. He had fought and died at Alma and Inkerman. But the state had defaulted on the contract. The outrage was so severe it toppled the government. The Prime Minister, Lord Aberdeen, was forced to resign. It was a financial scandal masquerading as a military defeat. The sheer cost of the disaster forced the hand of the establishment. It became clear that the proprietary model of the regiment was actually more expensive in the long run. A dead soldier is a wasted investment. Every man who died of cold because of a cheap coat cost the state £100 to replace. The savings of the colonels were costing the treasury millions. Under this immense pressure, the tectonic plates of the military economy finally shifted. The government seized control of the supply chain. In 1855, the clothing colonel system was effectively abolished. The state took over the direct manufacturing and supply of uniforms. It was the end of the regiment as a private franchise. The colonel lost his profits, and the soldier, for the first time, received a coat designed to keep him warm rather than to keep his commander rich. But as the smoke cleared over Sevastopol and the surviving skeletons returned home, the government faced a new problem. These men were broken. In previous centuries, they would have been cast adrift to beg. But the press had made them heroes. You could not let the heroes of the Crimea starve in the gutter. The Iron Ledger had to expand. It had to invent a new concept: social responsibility. The aftermath of the Crimea brought about a period of painful auditing. The British establishment, terrified by the incompetence exposed in the mud of Sevastopol, realized that the army could no longer be run as a collection of private fiefdoms. It had to be professionalized. But in the world of the Iron Ledger, professionalization means only one thing: centralization. The target was the officer class itself. For a century, the purchase system had allowed wealth to trump ability. A rich incompetent could buy a regiment and run it into the ground, while a brilliant but poor tactician rotted as a lieutenant. This made sense when the army was a constabulary force. It made no sense against the rising industrial powers of Europe, like Prussia. In 1871, the Secretary of State for War, Edward Cardwell, launched the hostile takeover of the century. He announced the abolition of the purchase system. The reaction from the officers was apocalyptic. They viewed their commissions not as jobs, but as private property. They had paid thousands of pounds for them. To abolish the system was, in their eyes, state-sanctioned theft. To silence them, the government had to open the checkbook. The Treasury agreed to compensate the officers, effectively buying back the army from its own commanders. It cost the British taxpayer roughly £7 million, an astronomical sum, to liquidate the equity of the officer class. The colonel was demoted from a proprietor to a senior manager. The captain became an employee. The regiment ceased to be a franchise and became a department of the state. For the private soldier, the Cardwell reforms were the slow dawn of a new economic reality. The bounty system, with its bait-and-switch tactics, was overhauled. The term of service, previously a life sentence of 21 years, was reduced to 6 years with the colours and 6 in the reserve. This changed the fundamental economics of the soldier's life. He was no longer a serf owned by the army until he broke. He was a short-term labourer with a hope of returning to civilian life. The stoppages also came under attack. It took decades to fully eradicate them, but the principle shifted. The government began to accept that feeding the soldier was an operational cost, not a personal luxury. The subsistence deduction was capped. Better food was introduced. Barracks were improved, not out of charity, but because the new statistical science of public health proved that it was cheaper to build a sewer than to replace a dead battalion. By the late Victorian era, the soldier was no longer the scum of the earth. He was Tommy Atkins. He was a public figure, celebrated in music hall songs and poems by Kipling. But we must be careful not to mistake branding for generosity. The soldier was still poor, the pay was still low, but the scum had been rebranded as a hero because the empire needed a better class of recruit to police its ever-expanding borders. The Iron Ledger had simply recalculated the cost of labour. It found that a slightly better fed, slightly less indebted soldier was a more efficient unit of imperial expansion. As we close the book on the Redcoat era, we must ask, what was the final verdict of this economic experiment? The British Empire was the largest the world had ever seen, covering a quarter of the globe. We credit this to the bravery of the infantry and the genius of the admirals. But the true architect was the accountant. The British Army was a miracle of cost-cutting. For over a century, the government managed to field a global police force essentially for free, by forcing the men who did the fighting to pay for their own equipment, their own food, and their own medical care. It was a pyramid scheme of misery, supported by the desperate poverty of the British working class. But this ruthlessness left a legacy that shapes our modern world in ways we rarely acknowledge. The destitution of the broken soldier forced the state to invent the welfare system. The Royal Hospital Chelsea, home of the famous pensioners in their scarlet coats, was not a gift. It was a necessity. You cannot train thousands of men to kill, strip them of their youth and health, and then dump them penniless on the streets of London without risking a revolution. The military pension was the first admission that the state has a permanent obligation to those who serve it. Furthermore, the colossal expense of the wars that this army fought, from the 7 Years' War to the struggle against Napoleon, forced the creation of the modern tax state. The income tax, introduced as a temporary measure to fund the war against France, never really went away. The bureaucracy built to feed, clothe, and pay the army became the skeleton of the modern civil service. We live in the house that the off-reckonings built. Today, the King's Shilling is a collector's item. The modern British soldier is a professional, paid a salary, with a pension plan and rights protected by law. The clothing kernel is gone, replaced by defence procurement agencies and massive corporate contracts. But if you look closely, the ghost of the Iron Ledger remains. We still debate the cost of boots. We still argue about the quality of equipment supplied by the lowest bidder. We still calculate the value of a soldier's life against the national budget. The story of the Redcoat is not just a story of battles won and lost. It is a cautionary tale of what happens when human beings are treated as line items on a balance sheet. It reminds us that behind every glorious charge and every fluttering flag, there is a cold, hard calculation of profit and loss. The Redcoats conquered the world, but they did it on an empty stomach, wearing coats that made their colonels rich, marching to the beat of a drum that was always counting the pennies. The books are closed, the debt is paid, but the cost was higher than any number can show. Thank you for listening to our story. If you found this history as fascinating as we did, please like this video and subscribe to British War History for more. We read all of your comments, so be sure to leave your thoughts below. We'll see you in the next video.